Well, hello everyone. Welcome to today's FSMA Friday presentation on what recent food industry trends may come with potential food safety risks and what we should all be thinking about to help mitigate these. There's clearly a lot to unpack with this topic, but before we begin, I just have to run through a few quick housekeeping items. First, we have many newcomers joining us today, so we're very glad you're here. FSMA Friday is a monthly series brought to you by Safety Chain and the Acheson Group that since 2012 has aimed to provide updates and insights to the changes that surround the Food Safety Modernization Act and provide you with expert advice on methodologies and tools to make sure that we're all meeting those regulations and compliance measures. So during the course of this presentation, we're going to mute all attendee mics, but we are leaving room at the end for some Q&A. So please do send your comments and questions, and we'll do our best to get through them all at the end of the presentation. But if we do run out of time and we didn't get your question, don't worry, we'll send you a follow-up right after today's webinar. And of course, this presentation is being recorded, and everybody on this call is going to get a link to the replay and the slides later on today. All right, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Ruth Petran, who has an extensive amount of experience in microbiology, food safety, quality assurance at companies like Pillsbury, General Mills, Ecolab. Actually, Ruth, you were the Vice President of Food Safety and Public Health at Ecolab, which is pretty awesome. Ruth is a frequent author, speaker, on all things food safety, and now is a key member of the Acheson Group team. So, Ruth, I'm excited to hear your thoughts today about possible risks that might be emerging from the recent food industry trends, and I really, really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate the invitation to be with all of you, and am happy that we have a nice size audience out there listening to some little tidbits from me. Thank you, Jim, for the kind introduction. And yes, I have done food safety for a long time. And through all of that, what really has emerged as my approach is thinking very practically about applying information that we all have access to, but applying it in ways that we can ensure food safety of the food items we're preparing, we're producing, we're serving in the best ways possible. And I've been struck recently by the fact that there's so much going on in the food industry, such excitement, such innovation, new trends and so on, which, make our food supply so much more interesting. But it doesn't come without risks. And I'm happy to share some of those thoughts with you today and share some of the new things I've been thinking about. But to start off, I think it's worthwhile to just keep ourselves grounded in some recent regulatory updates that have occurred, say, within the last month or so. FSMA related for sure, but also FDA kind of information as well. First is the release of the 2022 Food Code. Those of you in manufacturing settings may be less familiar with this, but this is really a model document that's been published for years and years by FDA as a model for food retailers. That is, those in food service and grocery, in catering, etc., to provide a scientifically sound basis to help safeguard public health and ensure that the food that's being handled, produced, served, etc., by those entities is unadulterated and honestly presented. And there's some key changes in that new food code that really represent a lot of great science. Along with that, and somewhat related, is the publication of a new guidance document for direct-to-consumer and third-party delivery service. Delivery is a trend that we will talk about in a little bit, and this is a document that has finally been pulled together, providing food safety best practices for managing and performing these direct-to-consumer and third-party delivery operations. So it includes parameters that are critical to help assess risk, talk about validation and verification, various recommendations for packaging, temperature control, receiving, storage, physical, chemical, contamination control, allergens, etc. Really, the intent is to provide best practices for preventing contamination of harmful bacteria and or the formation of toxins for the food while it's being transported. And that's an important pieces of information that we all need. And finally, the FDA finalized their guidance related to the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which is one of the FSMA regulations. This particular document includes recommendations on the requirements of how hazards need to be analyzed in foods, how to evaluate a foreign supplier's performance and the risk posed by them, and how to determine and conduct the appropriate verification activities, all with the goal of helping to ensure that imported food into the U.S. meets U.S. requirements and is not adulterated with respect to misbranding, etc. So again, some helpful documents have been out. There's new things all the time, but these are a couple real notable ones. But now to the meat of what we're going to talk about today. So lots and lots of trends and things are happening within the food industry, and we've really seen very widespread, what I'm calling transformation in the whole food market. We'll talk more about the ideas of expanded food choices and availability of food, certainly some changes in the way we get our food to make it basically available 24/7. And then technology is burgeoning in the food industry just as it is everywhere else. So with all of this, though, we need to be very considerate and think about the implications of some of these new things going on and what hidden food safety risks could have emerged with all of this innovation. I want to leave you with a couple thoughts about how we can manage those potential risks. So the first transforming trend I want to talk about is just the fact of expanded food choices and availability. And I clipped out this ad. I live in the Minneapolis area, and I clipped out this ad from around Christmas time from our local newspaper and one of our local grocery stores, a place called Cub Foods. And I'm struck by the fact that look how many various produce items were available in Minnesota in December. Pineapples and oranges and cherries. You know, virtually all of the items on this ad sheet traveled really, really long distances to get to Minnesota for sale in our stores at that time frame. So as I look at this, I'm excited by the fact that I can serve all these great things to my family. But I do think about the fact that, again, this food traveled very long distances and probably had some alternative growing areas than perhaps traditional. We're seeing burgeoning growth of indoor agriculture and hydroponics. I do wonder if the agricultural practices or gaps are frankly good enough in these operations. Now, I have no reason to believe otherwise, but it is something to keep in mind because this is reality for all of us. So when we talk about good agricultural practices, here's a brief listing of those from the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is part of the WHO. This is an internationally available document, and basically GAPS focus in these areas of possible risk to growing produce, thinking about hazards from soil, water that would be used for irrigation and its source, agricultural chemicals that might be used, the presence of animals in the fields, and hygiene of both the workers and the equipment, transport vehicles, etc. So again, there's good information like this to help guide what should be done to ensure safe produce. But there are some risks with produce. A recent report from an interagency organization and whose reference is shown on the bottom of this slide revealed the facts such as that 58% of E. coli 0157 illnesses are attributed to so-called vegetable row crops, such as leafy green. And we see 28% of the total salmonella illnesses that occur in this country attributed to 4 food categories, all in the produce space. And then we know that pesticides certainly are helpful to prevent large crop losses and continue to play a very important role. But the effects of exposure to these by humans and the environment continue to be a concern. I'm not saying again that the produce in that ad that I showed before has these issues there, but we need to keep this in mind because there are risks that can occur and need to be managed appropriately, even if we're sourcing produce from thousands of miles away. A second example in these newer foods today is just what I'm calling alternatives to traditional foods. Now, shown in the top part of this slide are different kinds of sugars that we can get today, that from maple and coconut, for example. And in the lower picture are pictures of lots of different kind of milks sourced from primarily agricultural items and not from cows. So we see oat and sesame, almond, coconut, rice, etc. Great to have all these options. And as a grandmother of a dairy allergic granddaughter, I'm excited that these options are available for her. However, we need to think about what allergens may be encountered in these, especially in the milks. We see sesame popping up, almond, coconut, and also in that sugar. Are there other chemical risks that might be posed? Heavy metals, for example, pesticides from poor management of these and the growing of these crops. And then just how is processing done? In this country, we've been blessed with having the pasteurized milk ordinance or guidance requirements from FDA on how milk is to be handled, processed, and made safe for drinking. That is focused on cow's milk primarily. But what about all these others? Are they aligning with PMO requirements? And now we have 9 major food allergens in the US that we need to be concerned about. Sesame was just added at the beginning of this year. Again, considering where these might appear in some of these unexpected places, such as in a milk or a sugar kind of product. We're also seeing a huge increase of health-focused foods. And here's just a few examples of labels that I pulled recently. Offering immune support, improvements in our mental well-being. I love this ice cream here down on the bottom that is supposed to improve sleep quality. I'm all for that. But again, how is processing done? What do we know about that? And what are the manufacturing environments like for these foods that are introducing new kinds of ingredients that have not been used as commonly in the past? We're also all searching for values. I thought this quote from the UK Food Standards Agency indicating that the majority of consumers in that country reported taking at least one action to save money on food. We have gotten some more positive information recently when the FAO indicated that the index of world food prices dipped for the 9th consecutive month in December. But regardless, there are still concerns that are out there. We may be purchasing less expensive cuts of meat. I think this recipe that I found for using chicken skins was interesting. Also, many of our store-owned brands have become more indulgence focused. Typically, these are less expensive alternatives, but often their quality matches the quote name brands very, very well. And Mintel is saying that the majority of consumers are saying that brand name isn't so important anymore. We also may be buying in bulk, and that makes me wonder about potential risks of spoilage or pathogen growth because we need to store all these foods potentially for longer times. So as we think about extended storage, we need to keep in mind the typical bacterial growth curve, where we know that over time, and that's the x-axis here on the bottom, bacteria will be able to grow. Certainly food is great growth media for microorganisms, and being aware of things in storage that could impact this growth, such as the temperature, the pH, the available water, any preservatives, or the atmosphere that might be around these particular foods that may be stored for longer times, is important to keep in mind to make sure that we're preventing growth as much as we can. I really liked this culinary forecast that the National Restaurant Association published recently. They showed a few different things in that kind of supports these ideas I've been talking about. Certainly there is a strengthening demand for restaurant experiences and so-called local flavors that can't be duplicated at home. And that's great news given the fact that we've really had to stay away from restaurants for the last couple of years for obvious reasons. And this was, the data were gathered from a survey of chefs who participate in the NRA. So I think it's very credible. We're seeing strengthening demand for innovation and tastes from around the globe, things like cell-grown meat. But we want a balance of healthy foods, but also comfort foods. The growth, though, of in-home dining is still up. In fact, a survey found that more than 3/4 of meals are prepared at home in this year, as opposed to around 50% in the past. Now, and I'm excited to see restaurant meals growing, and I certainly frequent lots and lots of restaurants as well, but I always keep this data in mind. CDC publishes data like these, indicating that essentially food prepared in food service settings, so restaurant caterers, etc., are the #1 site where foodborne illnesses seem to be reported from. Some of that is a bit of an artifact from the reporting mechanisms, which tend to go through complaints and so on. But regardless, there are challenges within the food service environments, and paying attention to best practices such as those published by the Food Code that I talked about earlier are essential to avoid these illnesses. And as we're eating out more, this needs to continue, obviously. Finally, we have plant-based foods, which we know have grown tremendously. This graphic here indicates really the attractiveness of the plant foods market, with lots and lots of growth of market share, growth over time, repeat customers, and the like. In fact, a recent study indicated that participants in so-called high climate impact areas, were more likely to order a so-called sustainable, and they define it as a non-red meat item, just to help with the environment. But there's some considerations here as well. The regulatory environment is developing in this area. I wonder sometimes, frankly, if FDA has enough resources to respond to these high number of expected inquiries of these new items, and how best are they to be labeled. There's certainly a lot of expertise that's needed, but there's just a large volume out there. I also wonder about potential chemical concerns. We know in Europe that the biggest reported concern in their regulatory tracking system are things in the mycotoxin, ethylene oxide, pathogen contaminant areas in foods like these. We're seeing issues with pesticide residues above tolerances, and things like aflatoxin being found in many, many crops. Not widespread, but certainly as we think about eating more plant foods, we need to be aware of these potential risks and make sure they're being managed appropriately. And a lot of these foods, frankly, are different and new. And I do wonder sometimes from a sanitation perspective, do we have the right expertise in these manufacturing plants to adequately clean these newer food soils? So now moving on to what I'm calling our second transforming trend, that is the availability of food really 24/7. Online ordering has certainly grown tremendously, and here's just a smattering of some pictures of things that I found recently that were interesting to me. You can buy jerky online. At the holidays, you could buy holiday cookies that were decorated, in this case, with a cream cheese frosting. You could buy fresh goat meat. And I thought this was particularly interesting, growth of a product called pink sauce that was very widespread on TikTok. And now I just read this week is being brought into a mainstream in one of the larger retailers here in the US. So again, lots of excitement, lots of variety that we can get. But how is it being processed? And what are the ingredients that are being used? What are the production environments like? How are these handled? How are these labeled? Not to say these may not be safe, and I don't want to suggest that, but it's certainly something to be concerned about and to be aware of to make sure these risks are managed. Now, delivery services certainly have grown as well. We see foods that can be accumulated by a retailer and set out for pickup. Lots and lots of ordering. This is a shot of some motorbikes with delivery bags on the backs of them that can deliver restaurant foods. We see these in urban areas quite commonly. Often these are so-called easy to carry foods, sandwiches, wraps, etc. But it makes me think a little bit because we know that norovirus continues to be the #1 cause of foodborne illness, which is primarily associated with human handling of foods. So are these delivery and preparation places paying enough attention to risks from humans? And what about temperature management? I highlighted that new document early on in this discussion related to managing delivered foods safety. And one of those is the importance of temperature management. We know that Clostridium perfringens, these lovely little green colored rods here, is also among the top causes of foodborne illness and is typically associated with poor cooling and holding of foods. Well, that's all well and good, but we have seen a couple of outbreaks in the last bit of time related to delivered food. One was an outbreak of salmonella due to an online food delivery in China, where 10 cases of illness occurred. It turns out that all of the students who were impacted had eaten chicken that was delivered with rice from the same restaurant over a 6-hour period. The food had been pre-cooked before the orders were anticipated and then was left out at room temperature. They were delivered quickly, but regardless, still there were illnesses that occurred and seemed to be linked to salmonella. And then more recently, we've seen an outbreak related to E. coli 0157H7. The traceback data indicated that ground beef sold in certain meal kits from a particular manufacturer was likely the cause, and 7 people became sick. It is estimated that the true number of people who got sick is probably much higher, but regardless, controlling the source of the particular ingredients in these kits and delivered foods is really important. Finally, the third transforming trend we've seen recently is the growth of technology. Now, this isn't all bad by any means. I mean, think about the ways that technology helps us in so many aspects of our lives today. And that's true in food safety as well. We have a very, very long history of technology working to improve food safety. You know, sanitation dating back thousands of years. And in fact, a lot of our modern sanitation is linked to epidemiologist John Snow in London in the mid-1800s, who discovered the link between poor sewage and drinking water sources and the incidence of cholera in patrons of that water system. Refrigeration, we know that ancient civilizations built underground food storage areas to cool food, and certainly using ice. And then technology came on to create machines to help keep food cold in the mid-18th century. And we had the first refrigerators in around 1830. Canning of foods was discovered in 1809 by French inventor Nicolas Appert, who found that heating food in sealed glass jars helped keep the food from spoiling. Pasteurization of milk is a very, very key technology that was initially applied to wine by our friend Louis Pasteur, but then expanded to the milk supply in the late 1800s. The use of refrigerated trucks came around in the 1940s when Thermo King started their operations, and data loggers today are widespread to help us record records of temperatures. More recently, we've heard about things like blockchain or these decentralized electronic ledger systems that can securely record all kinds of transactions or block in those chains. This results in a very secure record at every step of the food through the supply chain, so there's more transparency. But what's consistent with all of these developments was that it took a lot of research and science and attention and time to perfect them and to get them to where they are today. We know that technology can offer a lot of clarity. It certainly tells us much more about our food. What we're seeing now is opportunities to expand traceability, to collect and gather insights that we can take information from, even things like contactless payments, which through the pandemic certainly were helpful to help us keep our distance from others. That's not going away. Technology also allows for consumer engagements, where consumers can engage much more easily with their food manufacturer, their local restaurant, etc., and provides feedback via social media. There's good sharing of information out there, but as I'm showing on this screen, there's also a lot of misinformation, unfortunately, that gets assumed to be correct. These couple comments here on the left are from a website to which people can input information about their foodborne illness symptoms and talk about what's happening. All in these two cases, obviously the onset times were very, very quick rather, really much quicker than would be typical for a foodborne illness from most kinds of foods. We also can hear information. Here's talking about organic wild seafood. Reality is there aren't really any organic standards for organic or for raising seafoods in that manner. So what does that really mean? I think it's curious that milk here is stated to be non-GMO. Well, the reality is that in the US, we only have 11 commercially available genetically modified crops, which are in crops: soybeans, corn, cotton, alfalfa, sugar beets, and a few different produce items. Milk is not on that list, nor is chicken. But regardless, this engagement is happening, whether it's accurate or not. The key is to think about how we can leverage these outcomes. I think an opportunity is that it has allowed for the growth of very credible resources. Food Science Babe and Smart Label, for example, are a couple of examples trying to refute the erroneous information, helping us learn more about how foods may be made, raised, or grown, essentially providing kind of a food pedigree. But regardless, I think we need to embrace the fact that information is being shared, and how can we use this to potentially drive innovation in the future. Now we know there's a food traceability rule as well that was just promulgated. You've heard more about this recently, I believe, but in a nutshell, this rule establishes the food traceability list of certain foods to which this applies. And those who manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods that are on this list are required to maintain records containing certain key data elements. These are associated with certain critical tracking events or steps in the supply chain, and the rule requires that information be provided to FDA within 24 hours or within some reasonable time frame. Compliance date is a bit in the future, but still we're in the 3-year time frame now, so it's important that those who are impacted by this regulation keep this in mind and work to establish the records that they need to. So again, there's a lot of emerging innovation, emerging technologies, and so on. We need to be able to maintain the balance for the diversity of our food supply with food safety. I truly believe that all of these foods and approaches that we've talked about can be applied safely, but there has to be a very deliberate focus on evaluating these safety risks. And the way to do that is with a very systematic process. So we know that industry has responded. The innovation we've talked about indicates this. Societal and sustainability offerings are being addressed. Consumer-focused risk communications are much more widespread than previously. But there is many more entities out there who may not be that accustomed to handling food that are in the business. So safely consuming these foods is certainly possible, but it takes this deliberate identification and management of risks along the food supply chain. And this needs to be a several-pronged effort so that those who are charged with managing risks, such as consumers, food manufacturers, food service providers, food retailers, etc., as well as those who provide regulatory oversight, that is government officials, must be fully engaged and committed to this process. Now we know that the whole hazard analysis and preventive controls determination, or really the foundation of FSMA, is the way that this is done. We know that there's many types of food safety hazards, many more today potentially from the information I just presented. Through a hazard analysis process, we are able to identify the known and reasonably foreseeable hazards. We can evaluate the likelihood and severity of these hazards to help hone in on those that must have a preventive control in place. And these span from processing allergens, sanitation, supply chain, or other types of preventive controls against these potential hazards, so that we know when a hazard analysis is done effectively, risk is reduced and efforts can be focused where need be. We need to think broadly in the categories of risks spanning biological, chemical, and physical areas, and then collect and evaluate information on these hazards and the conditions that may lead to their presence to decide which are significant and must be addressed. We need to keep in mind that the hazard analysis is a two-step process. One is identifying everything that could possibly be a hazard, and then evaluating to allow us to hone in on those that are most likely to occur and are most severe. So as FSMA tells us, although this is very much rooted in HACCP principles as well, listing out the processing steps and ingredients is important, identifying those hazards, very specific to how it may be manifested within the situation, the food, where it's sourced from, the manufacturing environment, etc., determining if those are significant, justifying the decision, and then making sure the right preventive controls are in place for those. And basically, these preventive controls can span these 4 areas that CDC has told us about for years, effectively implementing basic practices in cleaning, in separation of raw and processed foods, of cooking foods properly, and chilling or storing foods at the right temperatures. I really think that if all of these were done effectively all of the time, we would have an even safer food supply. So to wrap things up here, we know that the food market has transformed significantly in recent years, and there likely are new food safety hazards that have emerged. But we have a way to manage these, and we've known about it for years. So following these sound food safety approaches that are rooted in HACCP and FSMA can really ensure that this innovation can be safe for all of us who want to consume these products. We do, though, need to be vigilant for risks that may arise and make sure we are ready to manage them. So we may need to broaden our training and outreach efforts to ensure that there's widespread understanding. You know, I guess the good news is that the work never stops, but that we need to keep doing it. So with that, I am happy to take any questions that may have come in. Jim, or do we have any?
Oh, sure. Yes, of course. Dr. Ruth Petran, thank you so much. I've been taking a lot of notes here. Obviously, there's again a lot to unpack with each one of these topics. I can't thank you enough for kind of walking us through these. There's obviously a lot more detail and resources that you provide us. So when we send the link to this presentation, everybody on this call will have a chance to dig in a little bit more and find those details. But I think the one thing that seems to pop up is around the point you made where, yes, you now can do online food ordering and you don't necessarily have visibility to how that food is being handled. You also mentioned there are groups such as the Food Science Babe or Smart Label that have assisted in this. But as a consumer, as somebody that obviously cares about what we're ingesting, how would a consumer sort of influence this movement? Because you just ended by saying, hey, broaden training and outreach. Do the consumer have the ability to call for more maybe insight around how food's being handled? I know you mentioned the government officials must be engaged. You also mentioned earlier that maybe the FDA doesn't have all of the resources to follow up appropriately. So again, just combining all of this together, how is it possible that we can really get a bead on how food is being managed from end to end?
Thanks, Jim. That is a really loaded question, though.
Really loaded question.
Yeah. And I'm not sure I have all of the answers to this, but I do think just being educated is really, really important. Um, I'm attracted by cool sounding things online, just as I think anybody would be. Um, but I'm a little more cautious about potentially jumping in and trying some of these things. Now, I know I'm a fairly conservative person in this regard, um, because perhaps I know a little bit about what the risks could be. I think keeping ourselves aware of kind of the maybe two I was going to say two sides, but maybe there's a bunch of sides of these newer items is really important. The good news is that there's an increasing number of educational resources out there, but making sure that we're working with credible ones is important.
Right.
So areas like universities and their extension departments, those are funded by the government and are really charged with helping the particular residents of those states where these universities are. It's promoting the agricultural industries within these states, but there also are a lot of resources available, often in very plain language, very current with what's going on today. So, I guess my base advice would be, being curious about what's out there, but making sure that you do a little bit of checking around to, just learn a little bit more before jumping in. And then certainly consumers do play a very important role in their own food safety as well.
Right.
Certainly we expect the foods that we buy, from a manufacturer or a retailer are safe, are following regulations and so on. And I think there's a lot of checkpoints from the federal government, but also state and local governments as well that are working to ensure that. But we as consumers, need to handle those foods appropriately. We need to cook them if need be, to the recommended temperatures. We need to store them. Um, so it definitely has to be this cooperative venture with all of us being willing to take responsibility here.
Yeah, 100%. I'm going to try to consolidate a couple of questions that have come in. You had mentioned earlier around plant-based food regulations are kind of now developing, and you gave the example where, there might be some sanitation risks for the newer um, food soils, the soils of which these new types of foods are being grown in. Um, how would you kind of respond to this emerging regulation? I know things take a while to get solidified, but in terms of, again, driving more awareness, how would a consumer and a food manufacturer, processor, kind of know the latest of what's going on in terms of where their food is coming from?
Again, another good question. You know, we are required in this country to, have very uh, informational labels on our foods, talking about the ingredients that that they're made from and so on. Um, I think it gets back to staying educated on what the sources of these various foods may be. Um, and the good news is that through the internet, there's a lot of information about, how various foods are made. So in some of those milk kinds of products that are not from cows, um, I've been able to learn a lot about how those are produced. And it's obviously very different than milking a cow and pasteurizing the milk that comes out of it. It's very interesting, but I think it does give us an awareness of, how do we get milk from an almond, for example. Um, you know, and just being aware of that. But at the same time, While that sounds like an interesting alternative, certainly to folks who may have dairy allergies, for example, um, marrying that availability with the fact that, yeah, but that's also an allergen, for those who may be allergic to almonds or other tree nuts. Not kind of forgetting that those realities that are there, kind of tried and true information in the fact that, hey, I've got a great alternative to, dairy-based or cow-based milks, yet I'm introducing this new allergen. So, again, I think it comes back to asking a lot of questions, um, going to the manufacturers themselves. Typically, there are, especially with these newer things coming out, I mean, these companies want people to buy their products so that they stay in business. So they're providing information to their consumer base is certainly something that they need to be doing to keep those consumers coming back.
Right. Yes, and let's talk about one question came in here from Ronald asking about that GMO example that you gave for the milk. Um,
Yeah.
and he was kind of asking around, is the feed, let's say it's another product, but is the feed that chickens receive generally GMO or non-GMO? He's looking to see if there's a distinction.
Yeah, I don't want to make a broad statement there. Certainly a lot of the um, I believe it's corn in the US is GMO. So if corn is the basis of the feed, I'm not an animal health expert really, so it certainly could be. Um, but how the feed that an animal is consuming um, impacts the nature of the food itself that we get from that animal. The milk that comes from the cow who might have eaten GMO corn, for example. Um, there that doesn't impact that at all. It's just, what the cow has been consuming.
Mhm.
But again, I kind of want to leave it there because I'm not that animal health person.
No, I get it. All right. Here's one that is interesting. There's a recent article that says the FDA is proposing new levels for lead in baby food. So the question is, why hasn't a zero tolerance of heavy metals or toxins been implemented in the very beginning of the food production manufacturing process? Is it not possible to get zero contamination across the board?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, we are learning more about what is in our food because of analytical testing capabilities that are improving all the time and are getting much, much more sensitive than they were. So all of a sudden, with this, again, burgeoning technology and these analytical tests, we are able to detect smaller and smaller quantities of things like lead that could be in baby food. What we don't have that goes along with that is the kind of relevance of those numbers, and the potential health impacts of these numbers. We are talking about excruciatingly low tolerances or detections of these kinds of products. Um, I think the efforts being made to set some tolerances and to gain more knowledge about the implications of those is important. And that's really what the FDA is working to do in the time periods here to come. Um, so I think, I don't want to answer that directly because I don't know that we know necessarily.
Right.
But I think we need to wait for the research. But I do think it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about, again, excruciatingly low types of levels.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's fair to say we'll never get to 100%, but we're trying our hardest to get there. And obviously,
Right.
as the technology evolves, we can get pretty darn close. Some question came in, and this is interesting around CBD. Obviously, there's some emerging regulations around this, but it's not quite in full effect. The FDA had indicated that they do not believe it is safe for foods yet, but apparently some states are offering CBD product within foods, but there's been little control over how it's been sold throughout each of these states. Do you have any insight on that, around the risks involved?
Um, Again, it's not an area of expertise, but I would agree with your comments that we have a bit of a patchwork approach right now, with different states um, regulating things differently. I think uh, I can only speak for myself, and I am extremely cautious and
Mhm.
concerned about, what we're seeing. Um, I'm going to wait till I see some science that gives me some information here. Um, I think, the adage of if it's, sounds too good to be true, it probably isn't, you know, um,
Just like
is,
the get better sleep ice cream?
yeah, yeah.
Sounds delicious.
Um, I think we just need to be cautious, and it is new ground here. I think perhaps the good news is that it is getting a lot of attention in various from state legislatures, which is then driving the need for and um, approaches for gathering scientific information and making it available. So, I know there's many more friends of mine, for example, in the food safety consulting world, who are focusing on things like CBD and than they certainly ever would have in the past. So, I think we're at the cusp of learning a lot more, but we need to keep in mind we're still at that cusp. We're not, over the hump yet.
Yep. Okay. This is a good one. Do you think that we will see any legislation coming out to ensure food safety from third-party delivery services? And this goes back to my earlier point. Consumers have no idea if the people who are delivering the food or handling the food were sick, or maybe there was something in the delivery vehicle that could cause an
Yep.
infection. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if we think about the existing base regulations that we have related to food. And if we're talking delivery, I'm going to imagine that this would be from probably a food service setting, so a food retail
Mhm.
or restaurant setting, for example. Those entities are governed by the local and state health departments or agriculture departments in the particular states that they're located. And they certainly need to follow various regulations to ensure that the food they're selling and serving, preparing is done safely, following, really HACCP principles, making sure that the right risks are being managed appropriately. Um, as these foods get to that delivery person who's taking it from that restaurant and bringing it to your house, um, it certainly gets a little bit more, you know, gray there. Um, but certainly, if I was a restaurateur knowing food was going to be delivered, um, I would do everything I could to make sure that it's safe. So, through things that I described are in that new guidance document related to packaging, for example, to make sure that those temperatures can be maintained through that, delivery time period. And then doing very practical things like perhaps limiting the distance over which deliveries can be done, within a half an hour or 5 miles or something to keep that time down. And then making sure that the kinds of foods that are going to be delivered maybe are a little bit more robust, than those that might be more sensitive to temperature or time uh, abuse would certainly be another thing to do. And then, vetting the delivery services um, to make sure that the proper training is given to those people who are doing that, so they are aware of their need for being sanitary and hygienic, paying attention to temperature control, etc., as they're carrying the food from that restaurant to someone's home.
Yep, 100%. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. I had a question around upcycled foods and also cultured meat or lab meat, about the individual risks for those. Have you heard anything specific?
Upcycled foods, I assume that is using foods that may be of, not 100% optimal quality, but
Right.
repurposing them. Is that what that is? Yeah.
Not intended for human consumption, but right, still of use.
Yeah. Um, I think they really need to be intended for human consumption if you're going to be consuming them. So, um, I mean, that's just what the regulation is in the US. We should not have adulterated foods, which have the potential to make someone sick,
Right.
being shipped and, provided to people. I think it's a matter of defining that, what are the
The
criteria that
use
makes that
purpose.
food, um, acceptable for human consumption or not, and making sure we're not crossing that line.
Right.
Um, a little bit of bruise on an apple may not allow it to be sold for the premium price, but perhaps it can be sold for a lesser price, um, because it's in all likelihood not going to make someone sick, but could be used in alternate recipes, for example, where the pristine nature of that beautiful apple is maybe less important.
Right.
So getting a little creative like that. Um, and then you asked about cell-grown meat as well.
Yep.
Um, I think at least our regulators have begun to think about how best to do this, and in regulating the cell lines themselves that would be used for producing the meat is being overseen by FDA and that whole, cell growth process. Once that line of cells becomes a piece of meat that looks like a piece of meat to you and I, um, it's my understanding that the Food Safety and Inspection Service, or FSIS, under USDA, will be then regulating it as they would a piece of meat, because it is meat. It just comes from a different source than that animal that would be traditionally, or that it would have traditionally come from. So there is a framework out there. I think we're pretty early in the industry, and it's not being used very widespread so far. There's some technology and economic challenges, I think, at the present, I think, which will be overcome. But the good news is that we have this framework there and very well established regulations on how meat needs to be handled and processed safely, and it's a matter of following those requirements.
Yes, which are constantly evolving. We had some
Yes.
questions around how the government is getting fully trained, how they're training individuals to handle these responsibilities of regulating some of these new emerging things. There's a few more questions I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to, but do you have any insight around, again, this goes back to a previous comment you made where I think you were talking about that plant-based food regulations, and you said there may not be enough resources at the FDA to fully regulate.
Yeah, I think it all depends on kind of supply and demand, you know,
Okay.
and how this takes off. Um, it's not to say there's, it'll be a waiting game, if it's a newer area, so there are resources available, but they're finite. So if all of a sudden hundreds of applications come in, it's just going to take time
Right.
for the FDA to wade through those. And like any other organization, as the demand increases, they will do what they can to meet that demand, which may be staffing up, retraining of people, um, doing outreach in some other way to meet that demand. But it's kind of this, a little bit of wait and see at this point to see what the needs are going to be on kind of a steady state standpoint. And I don't think we know what those are.
No, you don't know yet. Yeah. All right. Well, I appreciate it, Ruth. Again, we have a few more questions I'll be sending to you after this presentation. Apologies that we didn't get to everyone, but thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your time today. Dr. Ruth, we loved having you today. Thank you. Please come back again. There's a lot more that we could talk about on this topic alone. If you have any questions around today's topic, or you'd like to get some more resources around either FSMA compliance or just general information regarding the food safety industry or regulations of food safety, please check out Safety Chains resources. And of course, please go visit the Acheson group. They are chock full of resources that you can get at your fingertips. And of course, any other questions you have for today's webinar, please pass them on. We'll answer them. We love questions, and we'll get back to you very, very soon. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ruth. We hope, again, you have a great, wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.